I would like to invite Mr. Michael Mullan to start the ball rolling. You're most welcome, sir.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Michael Mullan. I head up the adaptation team in the OECD's Environment Directorate. Since time is short, I'll kind of get to the point. Okay, so I think I'm probably the fourth person this meeting to present, if not exactly these figures, something very similar about global investment needs. This is from a recent report we produced on investing in climate investment in growth. I can recommend it to all of you. I think there's basically 2 points I'd like to make here. Firstly, when we're talking about mobilizing climate resilient infrastructure, we're in a way talking about two things. Firstly, we're talking about how do we mobilize the required investment for infrastructure per se? And secondly, how do we make sure that that investment is mobilized in a way that is climate resilient? Because we know that the investment that happens for other reasons will then constrain our options in the future about how we respond to climate change. Like across most of Europe, there are roads, and the reason the road is there is because the Romans built that road 2,000 years ago. So it's not just the 30-year lifespan of the particular asset, but these decisions that are being made can have implications potentially over hundreds of years. One thing I don't think we covered yesterday was what is climate resilient infrastructure. And I suspect if we did a survey here, but we don't have time, I'm sorry, we'd have very different views about what it might encompass. I put up some examples. So this combined road and stormwater tunnel in Kuala Lumpur, a new approach to managing the risk of cloudbursts in Copenhagen using green space, then considering climate risk in the refurbishment of hydropower in Tajikistan, modifying the maintenance regime of nuclear power plants in France. The point here is that what we call climate resilient infrastructure covers a bundle of very different things with very different implications in terms of what kind of benefits you're looking at, what stage of the project cycle are you looking at, where might the funding come from. So I think, in general, we need to be pretty careful about, when we're talking about mobilizing finance, when we're talking about barriers, what exactly are we talking about? For this, what follows is meant to be generally applicable to all of these different use cases. So, we published a report a few months back called Climate Resilient Infrastructure, Getting the Policies Right. The gist of this is, in principle, there are lots of benefits from resilient infrastructure in the economic sense. Better reliability, potentially reduced service cost, increased lifespan, co-benefits. So the question is, how do you take these economic benefits and translate them into incentives, into a funding stream that then provides an incentive for owners and operators to take these climate risks into account? Now, this summary is done for OECD countries. I think the picture is probably going to be pretty similar when looked at globally in terms of evidence provision, considering climate risks, looking at policy regulation, and lastly, disclosure. On the evidence provision side, I think there's been a lot of progress in this area. We have a much clearer sense of what the climate risks might be. In the discussions we've had, I think the gap is not so much now how will the climate change. There's still a lot of work to be done on that. But it's more, okay, how do we take this information about how the climate might change and turn it into usable information in the context of a specific project, and turn it into the kind of decision criteria that are familiar for people who are building roads, building ports, maintaining power stations, and so forth. The second point, accounting for climate risks. For either infrastructure that's directly commissioned by the public sector or where the public sector is acting as a funding body, we've seen a lot of growth in terms of the use of screening and decision support tools. The multilateral and some bilateral development banks have really been at the forefront of trying to put this into practice. We touched upon it yesterday. I think what we're seeing is that the screening is the starting point, but the hard part is once you've identified the risks, coming up with the measures to then manage them. Unfortunately, amongst OECD countries, we're not seeing a huge amount of use of this kind of risk screening for public investment. The second point in terms of contractual arrangements is that, particularly when you're looking at PPPs, who bears the risk is really fundamental, and making sure you're very clear about A, who bears the risk in terms of the contract, but B, who actually has the capacity to bear that risk in practice. You saw quite a nice example in Colombia where, following the floods in 2010-2011, they then changed the contractual arrangements for PPP to strengthen insurance requirements for road concessions, which both reduces the government's liability, but also then provides a stronger incentive for the concessionaires to consider climate risks. On the policy and regulation side, we've had already some discussion about this yesterday. I'm glad to see that in the agenda today we have more discussion about how you move from a bespoke model of how will the climate affect this specific thing to changing the standards in such a way that by default new infrastructure is built in a way that is prepared for the impacts of a changing climate. Okay, disclosure. This is really fundamental, and I think there are three benefits from improved climate risk disclosure. The first one is it provides potentially a price signal in terms of distinguishing this is the resilient asset from this is the less resilient asset. The second one is in terms of interdependencies. We know with infrastructure, the vulnerability doesn't just depend upon this network in isolation, it's how it connects to other networks. By having better information sharing on where the risks lie, people are in a better position to manage the vulnerabilities that are arising outside the fence line of their own operations. The third one, and we've seen this in the UK with the adaptation reporting power, is that merely the process of having to report on the vulnerabilities can raise the management attention and provide an incentive to take this issue more seriously. I think we're already seeing some good initiatives here, and it's an area that I think we have a real challenge in terms of not just having the information is available, but having the information is available in a way that can drive and influence decision-making. Taking what's fundamentally very disparate impacts and risks and information and putting it in a more standardized form that can then be easily used by investors, by the public sectors and others to influence their decision-making. Okay, to conclude. Firstly, and actually this isn't a conclusion because I haven't mentioned it, but when we talk about climate proofing or climate resilience, it's kind of presented as a binary. This is a climate resilient thing and this is not a climate resilient thing. Of course, this is a nonsense. Given an uncertain future, it's not about this is resilient, this is not resilient. It's about what is the acceptable level of risk, who decides on that acceptable level of risk, and what measures can be taken to maintain that acceptable level of risk. And I think there's no presumption that that will be the same in every context. So when I buy my internet connection from Orange, their promise is that it will work most of the time, and I'm happy with that. When Amazon buys their internet connection, they want a guarantee that this thing will basically never break, and consequently are willing to pay much more for that. I think this is an area where I think there's a lot of scope to unpick who gets to decide how do we communicate what the level of exposure and what constitutes an acceptable level of exposure given a changing climate. Second point is, I think, a clear one, which is better information being a prerequisite but not sufficient. Third one, when we're looking at the policy environment, when we're looking at what are the incentives, what are the disincentives, what are the market failures that need to be resolved, what are the policy failures, for want of a better word, that exist, it's not just about this is the new thing, this is a point the gentleman made just now, but actually looking across the whole lifespan of the asset. The last one, in terms of then the complexity of identifying climate resilient, blah, blah. If you think back to the examples of what is climate resilient infrastructure I gave at the beginning of the presentation, none of them neatly meet that model of, okay, the normal road would cost X, and the climate resilient road would cost X plus 10%. In the Copenhagen case, actually, this was much cheaper than business as usual. In the Kuala Lumpur case, this required big upfront investment, bringing together different budget streams, one for flooding, one for transport. In the case of the French power sector, it's not really about upfront investment, it's about doing things differently. So when we're saying, what is the additional need, this becomes a very complex issue. Okay, well, with that quick gallop through, I hope that's provided some good context. More information on the points I've made can be found in this working paper, which is on our website. And of course, if you have any questions, send me an email or talk to me in the break. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we need progress. And